The year is 1184 BC, the location, the Aegean Sea off the coast of modern-day Turkey. The Greeks have just successfully invaded and sacked the city of Troy after a long siege. A young prince named Paris lies dying in front of the temple of Apollo. He had been mortally wounded by an arrow fired by the Greek hero Philoctetes. But Paris wasn't just any Trojan. He was the man who had triggered the war by stealing the beautiful Helen away from her husband, the Spartan king Menelaus. And now his dying wish is to be avenged. A few miles away on the Greek side, the greatest Greek warrior, Achilles, sits in his tent sulking after refusing to fight in the Trojan War because the war's leader, Agamemnon, had taken away his war prize, the beautiful Briseis. But Achilles isn't sulking for long. His close friend Patroclus begs him to let him borrow his armor so that he can join the fray and help the Greeks stave off the Trojans. Achilles reluctantly agrees, but warns Patroclus not to go too far, or else the Trojans might take his life. Unfortunately, Achilles' warning goes unheeded, and Patroclus ends up being killed by the Trojan prince Hector, who is arguably the greatest Trojan warrior. Upon hearing this news, Achilles throws caution to the winds and joins the fighting. Now, it's only a matter of time before he gets his hands on Hector and avenges his best friend. In their epic battle, the two warriors trade blows until at last Achilles overpowers Hector, kills him, and desecrates his body by tying it to the back of his chariot and dragging it around the walls of Troy. It's a brutal end to a great warrior, and likely the worst fate that could befall a Trojan. But what if there was a way that Troy could escape all of this? What if they could even strike back at the Greeks and win the war? That's what we'll explore today on Paleologic. It's me. This is the story of the Trojan War, the greatest conflict between the ancient Greeks and the Trojans around the walls of the city of Troy, except for the part where the Trojans won. We've talked about the origins of the Trojan War in depth in our episode about Paris and the judgment of Paris. So in this episode, we'll start things off right after Paris has been killed by Philoctetes, and the Greeks are ready to pounce and finish off the Trojans once and for all. But before they do, the Trojan king, Priam, makes one last-ditch effort to get the Greeks to spare his city. He sneaks out of the safety of the city walls and journeys to the Greek camp in the middle of the night. There he falls at the feet of the mighty Achilles and begs him to end the war and return Helen to the Trojans. At first, Achilles is angry with Priam for having raised such a terrible son as Hector, who had killed his friend Patroclus. But eventually, Achilles softens and allows the Trojans to keep Helen and end the war. As a token of goodwill, Achilles returns Hector's body to Priam, who then holds 11 days of funeral games in Hector's honor. After the funeral, peace finally settles upon the land. At least that's how the poet Homer tells it in the Iliad. But there's another version, one that's perhaps more well-known, that paints a very different picture of the end of the war. And this version comes to us from the classic poem, the Odyssey. You see, while Homer gives the account of the Trojan War in the Iliad, Virgil gives the account of the sack of Troy in the Odyssey. So how does Virgil's version compare to Homer's? And why is it so different? You see, according to Virgil, instead of making peace with the Trojans, the Greeks simply attack and destroy their city. They kill everyone in sight and burn the city to the ground. Even worse, the Greeks don't even steal any treasure or plunder because they've grown tired of the war and just want to go home. But there is one group of Greeks who aren't quite ready to leave yet. Odysseus and his men sail away from Troy with as much treasure as their ships can hold, including the famous Palladium, an ancient statue of the goddess Athena, said to ensure the safety of any city it protected. With no further ado, Odysseus and his men set sail for home. Meanwhile, back in Troy, King Priam and his family were able to save themselves by escaping into the nearby forest. Once safe, they watch helplessly as the Greeks destroy everything they've ever known. But they weren't the only ones watching. Unbeknownst to the Trojans, a group of their former allies called the Amazons, led by their queen, were also watching from afar. When the Amazons heard that Troy had been attacked, they got worried that the Greeks would come for them next. So they decided to hide inside the walls of Troy and wait until the Greeks left. But when the Greeks did leave, the Amazons didn't leave with them. Instead, they attacked the Trojans and took everything they had. The Trojans were helpless to stop the Amazons, and so were forced to flee into the mountains, where they lived as nomads for years. In the end, the Trojans weren't strong enough to resist the combined forces of the Greeks and Amazons. Their entire civilization was destroyed, and their people scattered to the winds. At least that's how Virgil tells it. But again, we need to remember that both versions serve different narrative purposes. Homer wrote the Iliad to celebrate the Trojan War and its heroes like Achilles and Hector, even though the Trojans lost. On the other hand, Virgil wrote the Odyssey to celebrate the Greek victory, and their heroes like Odysseus and Diomede, even though they had nothing really to do with the ending of the war. In fact, Virgil doesn't even mention Achilles in his epic poem. Instead, he focuses on Odysseus and his ingenuity, which leads us to ask, how does Odysseus escape from Troy with his treasure? Well, through the use of one of the greatest tricks in history, the Trojan horse. As you may already know, according to Virgil, it went something like this. After the Greeks defeated the Trojans, they decided to build a large wooden horse as an offering to the goddess Athena. Inside the horse, they hid some of their bravest warriors, including Odysseus himself. Then one night, while the Trojans were partying, celebrating their victory over the Greeks, the warriors snuck out of the horse, opened the city gates, and let the rest of the Greek army in. The Greeks and Trojans fought one last battle, and this time the Trojans couldn't withstand the Greek onslaught. They were quickly defeated, and the Greeks pillaged the city, killing many Trojans and taking their treasure with them as they sailed back home. Again, this version differs greatly from Homer's, where the Greeks simply sail away from Troy and everyone goes home happy. But again, we need to remember that Virgil wrote the Odyssey hundreds of years after Homer, and during a completely different historical period, a time when Rome was trying to shed its Greek influences and forge its own unique path in the Mediterranean. And one way Virgil could do this was to claim that the Romans weren't descendants of the Greeks, but rather of the equally important, if not more important, Trojans. In fact, Virgil claimed that Rome was founded by Aeneas, a Trojan prince who survived the fall of Troy and eventually made his way to Italy, where he founded the city of Rome. But regardless of whether you agree with Virgil's assertions about Rome's heritage, one thing is for sure: without the Trojan horse, none of it would have been possible. Now, unfortunately, aside from Virgil's epic poem, the story of the Trojan War and the Trojan horse comes to us from a variety of sources, most of whom are secondary sources writing long after the fact. Because of this, we can't possibly hope to discern fact from fiction, especially since oral tradition kept the stories alive for so long before they were written down. As a result, we're not even sure if Troy actually existed, let alone what role the Trojan horse played in its destruction. However, recent archaeological discoveries may have solved this problem. In 2012, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a large wall that surrounded the ancient city of Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey. The team responsible for the dig believes that this wall may have been built by the Trojans after their ally, the Egyptians, told them about the construction of defensive walls that surrounded their cities. And if this theory proves correct, it would mean that Troy was one of the first cities in the ancient world to adopt defensive fortifications, suggesting that it was an important trading hub. However, despite the city's impressive defenses, archaeologists have found evidence of a catastrophic fire that destroyed much of the city. And dating evidence suggests that this occurred around 1200 BC, exactly when the city of Troy would have been sacked, according to the Greeks. But this isn't the only evidence we have of Troy's existence. In 1870, an Austrian archaeologist discovered the ruins of a citadel on top of a hill near the coast. He identified this place as Troy and began excavations that uncovered layer after layer of occupation going back to the Bronze Age. Today, thanks to the work of countless archaeologists over the past century, we have evidence of 7 distinct layers of human habitation going back to 3000 BC. Each layer represents a new culture that either settled in Troy or conquered it and made it their own. This means that Troy wasn't just a small village, but rather an important trading post occupied by a variety of different cultures throughout prehistory. What's more, each layer contains evidence of destruction, including burned buildings and weapons lying around, suggesting that Troy was often a victim of outside conquest, maybe even by the Greeks. This helps to explain why the Greeks would go to such great lengths to claim Troy as their enemy. So what do you think? Do you believe the story of the Trojan War as outlined by Homer and Virgil? Or maybe you believe neither and think it was all just a myth designed to glorify the Greeks and Romans? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as a reminder to all my viewers, I just want to say thank you for watching this channel. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting us on a crowdfunding platform. That's all for now. I'm the host. And remember, stay informed. Most importantly, stay free.